Welcome back. Last time we talked about the day the music died. So this was in 1959. Everything by the end of 1959 for rock and roll started to seem like it was falling apart. Little Richard, who was one of the 5 most prominent figures in rock and roll at the time, remember he had that plane incident where he thought he was going down. He prayed to God. He said, if you carry me through this, if I survive this, I'm going to go into ministry. He does survive. The plane lands safely. So Little Richard abandons rock and roll to go into ministry. Elvis enlists in the army. Jerry Lee Lewis had that scandal where he married his 13-year-old cousin before he was officially divorced from his second wife. Then Buddy Holly died in a plane crash. And Chuck Berry was arrested for what many scholars suggest were trumped-up charges for violating the Mann Act, which was escorting a minor across state lines. However, there was very little, if any, evidence to suggest he actually did that. So anyway, those 5 important figures are no longer in the game. In addition to that, because of the payola scandals, and again, the payola scandals were when a record company, either a major or an indie label, would pay radio producers or radio DJs in some way. Maybe they could be making financial payments or maybe they were gifts, but they would somehow compensate them in exchange for those radio stations playing certain songs and turning them into hits. Well, everyone was doing this, but the major labels brought this before Congress, and everyone was penalized, but it was a strategic move because the major labels knew that they had the financial resources to see themselves through this with legal fees and whatnot. They knew the indies couldn't. So what happened is a lot of these indie labels are no longer able to make music the way they were before. Specifically, Alan Freed, radio DJ from originally Cleveland, Ohio, relocated to New York, credited with coining the term rock and roll. He was devastated. He really lost everything in this. And the one person out of these 7, the 5 artists and these 2 other people that we're going to talk about who succeeded was Dick Clark. Dick Clark, the host of American Bandstand, basically he survived this by owning up to it up front, apologizing, saying he wants to do the right thing, and Congress was very receptive to that. So by the end of this, moving into 1960, the only major figure who's going to continue to be prominent in our story is Dick Clark. So for both audiences and for the recording industry, the early 60s, like the tail end of 1959 and 1960 through 1963, is really defined as the search for the next Elvis. Elvis was so important in so many ways. He brought together mainstream pop, country and western, and rhythm and blues. He was appealing to all audiences, men, women, all races, and he was just this amazing singer, amazing performer. He could do everything really well. So he demonstrates how much money in record sales can be made from one person who appeals to everyone. So that's the point of this section, is how do we find the next Elvis? Who's that going to be? And that's really going to drive the next few lectures here. This period, 1960 to 1963, is interesting in that many people refer to it as a golden age for music, and others refer to it as the dark ages of music. And one of the aspects that I think is most interesting about this section is learning what all of you think about this. So this is an idea we'll return to. So as we go through this lecture series, these next few lectures, I want you to keep that in mind. Does this time period represent a golden age for music where music is at its best, or does it represent the dark ages where it's not that the music's bad, but it represents corporate greed and it's too industrialized, things like that. So those are some points I want you to keep in mind as we go through this. But everyone's looking for the next Elvis, someone who can have the kind of mainstream success that Elvis received. So what is called the Brill Building is going to be one attempt at this, at finding the next Elvis. Now, up to this point, we've had this model of Tin Pan Alley. Again, when you think Tin Pan Alley, you have to think that the song is the most important thing. And it was named after that actual alley in New York City where all these songwriters were working. And some people were songwriters and they would compose music. Other people were performers. There was no expectation of crossing over, one doing the other job. And the point was to get as many artists to record your song as possible. That's all going to change during this time period. We're going to move away from Tin Pan Alley and we're going to talk about the Brill Building approach, which will be the second of the 3 approaches we talk about in this class. We're also going to see the rise of the record producer who controls the sound and the direction of music. So up to this point, everything was very compartmentalized. Everyone had their own role, and the producer's role was actually pretty minimal in the grand scheme of things. But during this period, we're going to see the record producer for music move into becoming a very important part of the songwriting process. And that's what we see today. There are plenty of people, DJ Khaled, Kanye West started out as a producer, Rob Cavallo of Green Day, My Chemical Romance, groups like that. Of course, George Martin with the Beatles that we'll get to later. But the record producer today is a big deal, featuring Jay-Z, produced by Jay-Z, something like that carries a certain amount of weight. And it's because of events that happened during this time period that became the case. We are going to see that the young teens, people who were, 13, 14, something like that, during Elvis's initial, period where he came onto the scene, they're now a little bit older. They're in college now, and a lot of that scene is going to move toward folk music. So before we had everyone listening to one type of music, but as we move forward, it's going to split in half, where half of the people, specifically the younger half, are going to continue to want this music that's targeted to teens and teen romance, things like that, whereas the other half are seeking something more mature now, so they're going to start listening to folk music. And folk music has this emphasis on being serious. It's serious. It's not romantic. It's not about these, silly childhood fantasies, things like that. It's about real music with a real message. We're going to see the rise of soul music, the rise of surf music, the rise of rockabilly music, and also this really interesting shift where a big part of the problem to many people in the first section of rock and roll, what we call the first wave from the 1950s, was that God wasn't present. A lot of people, especially a lot of Christian communities, were really upset over the things they were singing about because they thought they were, unholy, things like that. What we're going to see in this time period, though, is a very interesting collaboration between white Jewish songwriters and African-American Christian performers. So many of the biggest hits from this period, from 1963, were written by someone Jewish, but performed by someone Christian, usually, almost always from the African-American community, specifically Southern Baptist African-American Christians. And you can really hear that African-American gospel influence in the music. So we'll return to that a little bit later. But anyway, let's jump into the first big section of this, which is the Brill Building approach to pop. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a successor to the Tin Pan Alley model. So the song is no longer the most important thing. From this point on, it's a specific version of the song, which is basically the model that we're still using today. This was in the interest of songwriters and publishing. So this was how can they maximize profits, the songwriters and the publishing companies. Now, Tin Pan Alley still had offices, but it was a decline. So I only bring that up to say that it wasn't an overnight change. It's not that just one night everything changed, but it was pretty quick in the scheme of all of rock history that this move happened, where it starts to be more about, well, I guess let's just jump into it and you can hear what it's going to be about. So it's called the Brill Building because there was actually a building in New York City called the Brill Building, and its address was 1619 Broadway, and there was a second building that was also part of this approach of writing songs that was still factored in, called the Brill Building approach, but they weren't actually in the building. They were in a place called the Alden Building, which was at 1650 Broadway, so just very close down the street. So the Brill Building is known for their division of labor for a record, and this was pre-Beatles, and it's also, the Brill Building is also where we see the rise of the producer. So basically what would happen is the Brill Building was about songwriters. You would have songwriters either working by themselves, but usually working in pairs, and they actually had an office in this building. And every office had a piano, and they would have a pad of paper. And their job, their 9-to-5 job, was to show up to work every day and write songs, write lyrics, write music. At the end of the day, they would take all the songs that people came up with, and they would play them for everyone in the building, and they would pick the best song. And basically the best song would get made into a record, and the point was to make it a hit record. So it was almost like a factory line model, where it's very intentional. You're trying to write about things that you think are going to resonate with young teenage audiences because they're the ones that have this new disposable income. They're going to be buying it. The Brill Building approach, even though there's a lot of amazing music that comes from this time period, it's often referred to as a Kleenex, like a tissue, in that a Kleenex is disposable. It's meant to be used and thrown away. It's not supposed to have longevity. They're not trying to take these songs to more and more artists. They're trying to write the song as quickly as possible, have it recorded by someone as quickly as possible, get it on the market, make as much money from that record as they can, and they don't have to worry about trying to get more out of that song because they already have moved on to the next song. They're generating at least one song a day, one amazing hit song a day, because there are so many people working together in this building, both the Brill Building and the Alden Building down the street. So again, let's talk about this division of labor. So you have your songwriters. So it's someone's job to write the song. It's someone's job to record the song. Usually you would have like a star, a singer come in with some name recognition like Elvis, something like that, right? They would come and sing the song. You would have a band of musicians. These musicians were hired for this gig. They are not a band that plays together regularly. They're not going to go on tour and promote this song. They are only hired to record the music. A lot of the time, the background singers were also hired. And in a few instances during this time period, we'll see that there may be someone who looks like a star but doesn't have the best voice. And that's actually going to be okay because they will even have professional studio vocalists come in and record the music, record the singing, and then just put the other person's face on the record. And sometimes they're not even credited for this. You would have your mixer or your sound engineer, the person who's actually responsible for microphone placement, getting all the levels right, getting the balance right, making sure all the sounds sound as good as they can. And the producer was basically the person in charge. But what we see is there are going to be a few very important producers who have this grand vision for the song, and they're so personally invested in this music that they want it to be as good as possible. So they start trying to gain more and more creative control, not because they're trying to take over, but because they want it to be done right. And they feel like other people don't understand their vision, so they have to be as hands-on as possible. What starts to happen though is even though initially people reject this model, right? Because you're essentially taking someone's job away, or at least not letting them do their job. If you're telling the sound engineer where to put the microphones or which microphones to use, or no, the bass needs to be louder, you're doing their job for them. And there was a lot of pushback. But these songs were really, really successful and very popular. And the executives at the record companies saw that. So of course, every time one of these rock star producers would create another hit, they would give them a little bit more creative control and a little bit more power in the recording studio, so that by the end of this time period, because they generated so many amazing hits, and I'm sure most of you will recognize a lot of them, some of you will probably recognize all of them, by the end of this, they had basically absolute creative control in the studio, where they were getting to create the song exactly the way they wanted it to be. The first two of these people that we're going to talk about are Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. So in the full story of the history of rock, there are two songwriters, a pair of songwriters, which are undeniably the most important, and that's Lennon and McCartney, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But before that, and they really hit America in 1964. Before that, Leiber and Stoller were absolutely the two most important people, and we should still think of them as being the two most important songwriters before Lennon and McCartney, but also the most important producers. So they were both Jewish, as we talked about, with this theme of Jewish songwriters writing music that will be performed by African American Christians. Jerry and Mike, though Leiber and Stoller, as they're usually referred to, even as teenagers, they really blended into and became part of the African American community. Not necessarily part of music, although music was part of it, but just in that they lived in a community where it was majority African American, so their friends were African American. They would go to African American clubs. They would date African American women. They would eat African American food, the food that was popular in those communities. So for all intents and purposes, they were assimilated into the Black community, and all their friends were Black. So when they started writing music, they were writing in the style that they grew up with. So even though they are white and Jewish, it sounds like this early tradition of rhythm and blues, because that's what they grew up with. So they started a company called Spark Records, and some of the groups they worked with were the Robins. They also worked with a woman by the name of Big Mama Thornton. And Big Mama Thornton was actually the first person to record a Hound Dog, which was written by Leiber and Stoller. And Elvis heard Hound Dog from Big Mama. Well, actually, he didn't hear it from Big Mama Thornton, even though it was her hit. but Elvis heard it and he wanted to record it. But Elvis heard it at a Las Vegas performance. Just some kind of random person who was singing and performing in Las Vegas was singing Hound Dog. And one of the big important differences between Elvis's version and Big Mama Thornton's version is Big Mama Thornton's was absolutely an example of hokum blues, where there are these sexual innuendos and double meanings and double entendre within the music. Elvis's doesn't have that. And that's a trend we saw all throughout the 50s. But it wasn't Elvis, and it wasn't Elvis's producers or anything like that wanted to make that change. When Elvis heard Hound Dog, this Las Vegas guy was already making those changes. So Elvis actually just thought those were the original lyrics. So that's an interesting example in that it follows the pattern, but for a different reason. So Hound Dog was a big hit for Big Mama Thornton within the rhythm and blues community, but it was an absolutely amazing hit for Elvis, one of his biggest songs to this day. It had the controversy around it of him dancing with, shaking his hips, and then he had that funny follow-up where he actually sang to the Hound Dog. So much publicity around that song, absolutely huge hit. And that really enabled Leiber and Stoller to gain more creative control in the recording studio, as we were talking about. They also worked with a group called the Coasters, and this group, the Robins, some of the members of the Robins went on to form the Coasters. They worked with Atlantic Records, which was a very important indie label in New York City, and they were thinking about how the songs would actually sound rather than working with an arranger or music director. So the Coasters, specifically working with Leiber and Stoller, were already crafting this song. So but before this, you would have actually had a music arranger come in, someone who would write the charts out with sheet music and give it to the musicians. They weren't taking that approach. They were just sort of jumping in the studio and recording the music and writing it as they went and coming up with these arrangements as they go. And that's how rock bands do it today, almost all of them. And this is the first time we started to see that in the story of the history of rock. So Leiber and Stoller are in New York City, and they're working very closely with the Brill Building writers. And even though they aren't always factored in as being part of the Brill Building officially, they were absolutely interacting with those people. So unofficially, they were part of the Brill Building, and they were certainly doing the same thing, the same model. So a lot of the people we're going to talk about after this point are from the Brill Building and the Alden Publishing Building. And I just want to say this, Alden Publishing and Brill, again, they're doing the same thing. So from this point on, I'm going to refer to everything as the Brill Building approach, even if it was Alden. So if you look it up in the textbook and you say, wait a second, these people were with Alden Publishing. Yes, but they're using what's called the Brill Building model. So from this point on, everything will be under the umbrella of Brill Building. So anyway, before we talk about these people, I just want to return this idea of Jewish songwriters. So there's actually a very rich tradition of Jewish songwriters in American music. And one of the primary areas where you will see Jewish music, music by Jewish composers, is actually Christmas songs. And you have to think about the fact that a lot of this was immigration to America in the early 20th century. Of course, as everything was going on in World War II, as the Holocaust was approaching and there was increased persecution of Jews, more and more people were moving to America. And then some people, this was actually during the Holocaust, once it already started, they were trying to immigrate here as much as they could. So we had this huge influx of Jews in America, and many of them were very talented songwriters. And one of the things that, like one could say, well, why does it matter they're Jewish? Like, why is that even relevant? Well, it's important for a few reasons. For one, Jews in America make up a very small percentage of all religions, but they make up an extraordinary high percentage of songwriters during this period. And it's because of the amazing emphasis of music in synagogues during Jewish worship ceremonies. So the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, two words for the same book, every single line, every single word has music attached to it. And if you look at the actual Hebrew, there's music notation underneath the notes. And if you were to go to a synagogue, even today, everything is sung. So in a Christian worship service, there's a lot of singing. There's singing at the very beginning. There's probably some singing in the middle, maybe during offering. And then at the very end, it's concluded with worship singing. And in a Jewish worship service, there's just as much singing, but I would argue there's even more singing, because whenever they're reading from the Bible, they're singing from the Bible because everything is sung. So music is so important in Jewish worship services. That these people who went on to become famous songwriters were around music all the time, much like their African American Christian counterparts who are the ones performing. Music has an incredibly rich tradition in the African American Southern Baptist Church. And so we're seeing that come together. These two different communities, both who grew up with so much music in their lives, it only makes sense that they would go on to find so much success as adults and as professionals. So I just want to list some of the Christmas songs which were written by Jewish composers, and I'd be very interested to know if you've heard of any of these. Spoiler alert, you've heard of all of them. White Christmas, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, Holly Jolly Christmas, Silver and Gold, Run, Rudolph, Run, The Christmas Song, also known as Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, Santa Baby, Silver Bells, Winter Wonderland, I'll Be Home for Christmas, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, Do You Know It's Christmas, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, and Sleigh Ride. So all of these composers were Jewish, and they're writing these Christmas songs because they come to America, and it's just part of, assimilating into American culture. No, they don't celebrate Christmas, but they understand its value, and they have a deep appreciation and respect for it as a holiday, especially as it's observed as a national holiday. So many of these same composers were working in a variety of areas and are going to become important figures moving on in our story. So with the Brill Building, let's talk about some of these important people. Again, Brill Building and Alden. So Alden Publishing was actually founded by Al Nevins and Don Kirshner. They were both Jewish. They were songwriters who would come to work at a piano and just write songs all day. So they were two of the people that really started this model, and then as they found success, they hired more talented songwriters to do the same. They would specifically write pop songs that targeted youth audiences. So what themes are important to young people, and then they would try to write about those themes. It was very much like a factory, and at the end of the day, like I mentioned before, they would all get together, play the songs, and then the best song would win. Or if there happened to be two amazing songs, of course, they both would be recorded. We have Jerry Goffin and Carole King down at Brill. They were both Jewish. They met at the Brill Building, but actually went on to get married. They wrote hit songs for groups like the Shirelles with the song Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow from 1960. Little Ava, who was actually their babysitter, again, they were married. They wrote the song called The Locomotion in 1961, and they just wanted to kind of hear how it would sound. So after coming home from this, I think she was 16 at the time, little Ava, they came home to relieve her from the babysitting duty. They said, hey, can you stick around for a second? Are you able to sing? She said, yeah, I can sing. They said, okay, we just want to teach you this song so we can play the piano. We just want to hear someone else sing it to work out the kinks. And they realized that she was actually an amazing singer. So they had her come in and record it. It was a #1 hit for her, and she didn't have any kind of music career before that. And then a song called Chains by the Cookies, which was later covered by the Beatles. Now, Carole King is going to be one of the most important people in our story of rock and roll. I would argue probably the most important woman in the story. There are a lot of really important women in rock and roll, but Carole King, I think, is going to be at least a contender for the top spot. So this is the first time we've talked about her as a pair, a husband and wife pair in the Brill Building, recording music for other artists. But keep her name in mind. We're going to return to Carole King many, many times over the next few units. We have Jeff Berry and Ellie Greenwich working with the Ronettes, with the songs they wrote like Be My Baby, and they were working with a producer by the name of Phil Spector. So Phil Spector is also going to be one of the most important producers. So we have Leiber and Stoller, definitely very important producers. Phil Spector, probably the most important producer we'll talk about this whole time. And then we have people like Rick Rubin at the very end of our story who are going to be important. But Phil Spector, this is your first introduction to Phil Spector. Remember his name. We'll come back to it many times. Jeff Berry and Ellie Greenwich worked with groups like the Crystals, with Da-Do Ron Ron, collaborating with producer Phil Spector. And then He Kissed Me, also with Phil Spector. Phil Spector was also a co-songwriter and producer for these songs. We have a songwriting team of Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann, who were also Jewish, and working with groups like the Crystals for songs such as Uptown, working with co-writer and producer Phil Spector. And we have this last group is a little bit different, and that we have Neil Sedaka and Howie Greenfield, and they were a Jewish pair of songwriters. But Neil Sedaka would actually be the one to perform these songs, so he was a famous musician at the time. And we have songs like Calendar Girl and Breaking Up Is Hard to Do. And with all of these groups, I listed just a few songs to give you some examples, but it was hit song after hit song after hit song after hit song. Every song, for the most part, that came out of the Brill Building approach was a #1 hit, or at least a very well performing hit song. Let's change topics a little bit and talk about something called teen idols. So teen idols are all about constructing an image. When the producer or an executive from a record company decides, okay, we're going to produce music for someone, but it's not that we're just holding open auditions and we're seeing who's going to come in and just give it to the most talented person. That's not how it worked. It was they decided they wanted to build this model, and they would find someone and they would select them based on how they looked and how they spoke and how they acted and how they sang and how they danced, and they would turn them into a star. And the author of the textbook, John Kovacs, actually describes this idea as teen idols for idle teens, because they're making this music to appeal to teenage audiences. That's why it's important that they are handsome or pretty. And this was all a take on the attraction of Elvis. But what's interesting is Elvis was considered very attractive, very handsome, but he was also very threatening, especially in the beginning of his career. Remember, he had this bad boy image. So the point of this is to take this attractive young person and turn them into a star, make them completely non-threatening, so parents won't have any objection to their sons or daughters going and buying this music. So especially for the males, we're really going to focus on male teen idols during this time period, but we're going to see a lot of them. And just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, groups like NSYNC or One Direction, these are absolutely closer to modern examples of teen idols. So this is something that started in the early 1960s, but it's a model that's going to carry through and is still used all the time today. Anyway, these young men who were hired by the record companies were marketed as ideal boyfriends because there was no danger of any kind of sexual advance. The songs were about, I want to hold your hand, I want to kiss you on the cheek, and I want to get to know your personality. You know, it wasn't anything else, nothing risque. And in fact, there is an episode of South Park titled The Ring, where they really make fun of this idea by parodying the Jonas Brothers. So if you've seen that episode, you know what I'm talking about. They are specifically making fun of these teen idols, this idea of teen idols. The most important thing to be a teen idol, what do you think it was? I think it was that you had an amazing voice, that you could write your own songs, that you could perform well. Nope, handsome. That was the most important thing. You had to be really, really attractive if you wanted to be a teen idol. If you could sing, even better. But it's not a deal breaker if you can't. They can fix that. They can give you voice lessons. They can have other people record your music in the studio, but they can't give you a new face. So the most important thing is that you're very, very handsome if you want to be a teen idol. A lot of these people were actually fashion models before. It's not that they were singers in their church choir. Nope, they were models. They were modeled after Pat Boone more than Elvis. And I'm going to tell you right now that that is a question on the exam. And most people get it wrong, and it's very clear in the textbook. I always try to make it very clear in the lectures, so I'm telling you right now, teen idols were modeled after Pat Boone more than Elvis, because Pat Boone was brought in as this performer. If you remember, he's a white performer. Specifically, his claim to fame was taking music that was popular by African-American artists, singing it in a non-threatening white way. So teen idols, think of the appeal of Elvis, but the nice, clean, non-threatening package of Pat Boone. If you remember, Pat Boone was, I think, was the 6th great grandson of Daniel Boone, the explorer from the following the Revolutionary War and the move as we started to push west. In addition to trying to find these new singers who would be teen idols, we also see Elvis himself being turned into somewhat of a teen idol. So remember, Elvis was in the war. He was in the Korean War. He was off fighting for the country in the army, but they're still releasing his music. And through this music that's released, and eventually Elvis does come back from the war, we start to see this change in his approach, where he becomes much softer, much less threatening, removing any sexual elements, because they're seeing that while a lot of people absolutely loved Elvis's music, he can appeal to a broader audience if he tones it down. We saw the same thing with Eminem in the mid-2000s, where as he started to back off from the most threatening aspects a little bit, he became even more popular and had broader appeal. So that's what we start to see with Elvis. And there are songs like Are You Lonesome Tonight and Can't Help Falling in Love. The song Are You Lonesome Tonight? I want you to take a listen to this one specifically because in the middle, there's this passage where he stops singing, but the music keeps going and he starts just speaking. And the goal of this, you hear this in a lot of this teen idol music, is it's supposed to sound like Elvis, if you're a teenage girl, is speaking directly to you. He's your ideal boyfriend in your mind, and those words about how I miss you so much, he's speaking to you directly. So it makes it quiet, it's a little bit of a whisper. And that's something, it's a recurring theme, but the song Are You Lonesome Tonight is a great way to hear that. And as I mentioned, I Can't Help Falling in Love with You is also one of Elvis's biggest hits from this teen idol period, 1961. So I mentioned that you didn't have to have talent. That's true, but many of them did have talent. So some of these people are very forgettable, but some of them actually were very talented musicians. So let's talk about some of the products of this teen idol period. We have Frankie Avalon, and Frankie Avalon was managed by producer and songwriter Bob Marcucci, who would groom these teen idols. And he almost had what they call a stable, where he had like all these young men he was working with, um, giving them voice lessons, giving them dance lessons, seeing how they would perform. And whichever ones did the best, those were the ones that he would actually take to the record companies. And Frankie Avalon was one of these people. A ton of songs. Venus from 1959, Y from 1959. He was also featured in the movie Grease. He is the teen angel that sings during the beauty school dropout sing. Um, Frankie Avalon went on to become an actor in movies, and he worked with Annette Funicello, who was a star of the Mickey Mouse Club. There's actually a joke about Annette Funicello in Grease, so both of them are referenced in one way or another, and they become a pair. They're always in movies together. They're always seen together, and so some of these movies include Beach Party and Beach Blanket Bingo. We have Fabian, also managed by Bob Marcucci, with songs like Turn Me Loose and Tiger. He's one of these guys where he is handsome, but he's not the best singer. Bobby V, who was performing the music of Goffin and King, Carole King. He had songs like Take Good Care of My Baby, 1961. We have Bobby Vinton with Roses Are Red, My Love, 1962. Bobby Darin, I think, Frankie Avalon is perhaps culturally the most important person, the one that is his name is most recognized, but Bobby Darin, I think his music is the most recognized from this period. Songs like Splish Splash, I Was Taking a Bath, 1958. Dream Lover, 1959. Great song. Mac the Knife, which is interesting because it's actually from an opera. It's from an opera called The Three Penny Opera by Kurt Weill, who was another Jewish songwriter. And again, it was all about constructing an image. So whenever you read teen idols, especially if you're taking an exam, but just in general, think about a constructed image. This wasn't someone who came to be a successful musician through their own hard work. They were selected by someone because of how they looked to become a teen idol. And they were very successful. Also remember that this is an ideal boyfriend. So hearing all of this, you may be thinking, wow, this is so cynical. You could argue that there's a problem with the Brill Building approach in that they're not writing songs from the soul, They're just sitting down, writing songs like they're on an assembly line, and as quick as they can, best one wins, get it out, record it. That there's something missing from that as an artist. You could also say that these teen idols represent corporate greed because they're just picking people that will sell music very well because of how they look. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying you should think that way, but I'm putting it forward to you because that's why some people think of this time period as the dark ages of music rather than the golden age of music. They think about, others think about it as the golden age because the music's amazing. Others think about it as the dark ages because of the business practices and how it was driven by corporations. And really, this is a great time to refer back to what happened with payola. Again, the product of the payola scandal was that these indie labels dropped off, were no longer able to produce music, at least not at the rate they were before, but specifically, the major labels took over what was rock and roll music. So what we're seeing during this time period is major labels' approach to rock and roll. I also want to take a second to say that even though in the Brill Building, they were writing music very quickly, they were still heartfelt lyrics. You can't just make something up that you've never experienced some version of before. All these songs were coming from some place in the composer's lives. And as I mentioned, these teen idols, yeah, a lot of them, like Fabian, didn't really have that much musical talent, but some of them did. Frankie Avalon is incredibly talented. So is Bobby Darin. So things to keep in mind. There's not one right answer. There's not one wrong answer. And I would certainly understand someone who took either position on this golden or dark ages of music. Okay, let's jump into the last theme of this video, which is producers and girl groups. And this is something else that's really going to come out of this Brill Building model in New York, although it's a little bit separated. So we already talked about this. Remember, the producer before the 1960s, the producer, they were just an A&R person. So it's artist and repertoire. They were just finding the person, finding the songs, putting them together. Say if someone brings you a song, okay, this is good. Like let's take one of these songs by Carole King and Jerry Goffin. So, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow? If you're the producer, your job is to listen to the song, decide yes or no whether it's worth recording, and then say, okay, now who's going to be the best person? And you've got, the Cookies, yeah, maybe. The Ronettes, yeah, they'd sound okay, but no, the Shirelles, they're going to really do a great job with this song. So that's kind of your job, putting that together. And then, of course, managing the money, purchasing things, buying things. Oh, we need 2 more microphones for this. Go ahead and get the microphones. They make sure the bills get paid. They make sure people show up. They make sure that the sessions run as efficiently as possible. And really, the music, it's very different. If we think about recording music today, we think about someone sitting in probably their room, but let's just say a recording studio with Logic or Pro Tools or something, and you're just playing by yourself to a click track or to a pre-recorded track of everyone else, and you stop it and you go back and you redo it, or maybe you drop in and you splice things. You can kind of Frankenstein these parts together. That's not how it happened back then. Back then, it was recorded live. All the musicians were in one room at the same time, and they were recorded. And the musicians were so incredibly talented that you didn't really have to worry about making mistakes. But maybe they'd play something differently. Maybe they'd say, I played my G chord down the open position. I think it would sound better as like a D shape up at the 7th fret. That's too bad. You're not going to get another shot at that. As long as the tape was pretty good in general, we're going to keep pushing forward. And that was the producer's job, because of course the musicians and the singers, they want to do other takes. They want to try to get it good. But if as the producer you think it's good enough, you're just going to keep pushing forward. And there wasn't really an emphasis on musicality or artistry. It was about efficiency. Leiber and Stoller come in and they begin to shape the record. So they really experiment with, well, how does the microphone placement affect the sound? If I put it directly in front of the singer, just a few inches away from their mouth, or what if I put it back a foot? Or on the guitar speaker, what if I have the mic facing directly at the speaker cone, or what if I have it off at an angle, or what if I put it on the side of the speaker cone? What if I face it away from the amp and we just get the amp sound as it fills the room? All these little changes and experimentation begin to happen. They experiment with other styles and genres, and what if we put a Latin flair on this? What if we use this Latin guitar style? They're really moving away from this Tin Pan Alley approach in so many ways. And this has a really particular sound, Leiber and Stoller, because they are making these choices. And as I mentioned before, they got to the point where they could ask for certain things because they were becoming the biggest names in the business. So let's talk about some more specifics from these Leiber and Stoller artists we already talked about. They're working with the Robins with songs like Smokey Joe's Cafe in 1955, the Coasters Down in Mexico 1956, Yakety Yak, one of the more famous songs from this time period, 1958. And Yakety Yak is about a kid who won't get his allowance if he doesn't do his chores. So that's who they're appealing to, right? Like this young adolescent. Those were issues that kids at that time period in the 1950s were worried about. Not getting their allowance and having to do chores, and what a drag that was. So they're really successful in that they're writing these songs. Leiber and Stoller are writing these songs that relate to their audience. The Drifters, There Goes My Baby, producing the Jerry Goff and Carole King song "We Still Love Me Tomorrow" by the Shirelles. And what was happening is Carole King was so talented that she was actually going in there and showing musicians how she wanted the parts played in between takes. So go to the guitar player and say, you know what, it sounds okay like that, but why don't you do it like this instead? No other songwriters were doing that like that at the time. And she picked up on this because Leiber and Stoller were doing this. They were taking this creative, artistic control over the music, and they were working alongside them and sing this. And Jerry Goffin and Carole King both began to see themselves as proteges and apprentices of Leiber and Stoller. And surely enough, they are going to work into this role where they are also becoming important figures in the crafting and shaping of music. Phil Spector, we've talked about Phil Spector a little bit already, and we're going to talk about him more and more. We'll come back to him at various points. But at this point, the main term I want you to associate with his name is called the wall of sound. So the wall of sound was a specific way that Phil Spector would record music. And what he would do is he would get as many musicians as possible in a room. So on a normal song, you would probably have one drummer, one guitar, one bass, one piano, maybe that's it, maybe a few horns, like a trumpet, saxophone, trombone, something like that. It was very minimalist because the emphasis was on efficiency. How cheaply and how quickly can we record this? Phil Spector didn't take that approach at all. He went, kind of a go big or go home. He would have 4 piano players on 4 different pianos. He would have 2 drummers, 4 or 5 guitar players, a whole section of trumpets and saxophones and trombones and all these other instruments, multiple bass players, a bunch of background singers, and he would get as many musicians as possible and put them in the room, and there was just so much sound being generated, and there were mics around the room, but when you have that many musicians in the room, the microphones don't just pick up the instrument that's right in front of them, they're picking up sound from all over. So all the mic, it's called bleed when one instrument goes into another instrument's mic. So there's so much bleed going on that it's just this one really dense sound. So you would say, well, why does he do that? Well, it's because car radios weren't very good, specifically car speaker systems, weren't very good in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And you could have this amazing music that, it sounds crisp and perfect if you have on really professional headphones or really professional speakers in a recording studio. But when you're driving in your car with your kind of crappy, really inexpensive stereo system, you're missing all those nuances. So what he would do is he would just make as big a sound as possible. The other thing he would do is it was all mono. So there's mono and stereo. Stereo is when sound is split. So one set of instruments and sounds goes to the left headphone, another set goes to the right headphone, and you get this stereo effect where it's like you're really in the room and you can hear that it sounds like sounds coming from different places. Again, that's great if you have really high quality listening equipment, but in a car stereo, you're gonna miss all that. So he would make everything mono. So it's really dense, lots of instruments, and everything is mono. Everything comes from every speaker. And in a car, that's what sounded the best. It was big, it was solid, and it was all coming from one source. So the wall of sound was developed for car radios. A few of the artists. So we've talked about some of these before, but we have the song called To Know Him, written by Phil Spector, written and produced by Phil Spector in 1958, performed by the Teddy Bears. And there's actually a story that goes along with this. So Phil Spector, his father passed away shortly before this, and he was at the funeral. He was looking at the headstone, and inscribed below his name, it said, "To know him is to love him." And it wasn't that Phil Spector didn't care about his dad or he was trying to be crass or something, but he was so focused on music, he could never stop thinking about music. So he read that "To know him is to love him" at his dad's funeral, and he said to himself, "It could be a good song title." And sure enough, he went home and wrote a song called "To Know Him Is to Love Him," turned it into a love song, not about his father, but just about, 2 young lovers. Phil Spector was another apprentice of Leiber and Stoller. So far we have Jerry Goffin, Carole King, and Phil Spector. And as you can imagine, these are going to be 3 of the most important people moving forward because they're studying under the 2 most important people. And Phil Spector is going to go on to mentor some of the most important bands in rock history. He's going to mentor the Beatles. He's actually going to produce one of the Beatles albums. So he's one of only 2 people to ever get to produce for the Beatles. He's also going to work with the Rolling Stones a lot. So if you want some great examples of the wall of sound, here are some songs you can listen to. And again, it might be interesting to listen to other music and then listen to this with your headphones on in your room, but I think you should listen to this while driving to really get the experience that people would have had in the early 1960s of that car stereo speaker and see how it sounds compared to something else. So here's some good examples. The Crystals, the Do Ron Ron, again, Barry, Greenwich, and Spector. The Ronettes, Be My Baby, also Greenwich, Barry, and Spector. And on that song, the vocals were actually by Ronnie Bennett, who would go on to be Phil Spector's wife later. And the Righteous Brothers, this is from 1964, but You've Lost That Loving Feeling, I think one of Phil Spector's best songs. So check those out. All right, well, that's it for this video. We have a few other short videos that we're going to do for this time period, but I will see you in the next one.